The night Constance Hale found a wounded man at her gate, the moon was a thin, indifferent sliver above the Nebraska plain, and she had been awake for an hour already. Listening to the wind work at the loose boards of the barn, she had not yet found the money to repair. She heard the horse before she saw it. Not the steady sound of a rider with business in mind, but the stumbling percussion of an animal moving without direction, its hooves hitting the frozen ground at intervals that told her something had gone wrong somewhere out in the dark. She took the rifle from above the door and the lantern from the hook without allowing herself to think too carefully about what she might find. 18 months of running 400 acres alone had burned that habit out of her. She crossed the yard and held the lantern up, and what the light found was a man half fallen from the saddle, one boot still caught in the stirrup, his horse standing with its head low and its sides heaving, too exhausted to do anything but wait. He was perhaps 35, lean in the way hard traveling makes a man lean, with a bullet wound high in the left shoulder that had soaked his shirt through and begun working into his coat. He was conscious, which surprised her. His eyes found the lantern, then her face, then the rifle. He made no move toward the revolver at his own hip. That, more than anything else, was what made Constance lower her weapon a fraction of an inch. A man fleeing the law reaches for his gun. A man running from something more complicated lies still and waits to learn whether the person standing over him intends to help or to finish what someone else began. He said his name was Jonas Creed. He said he had been thrown from his horse when the shot took him, somewhere out on the county road, and that he would be grateful for water and would trouble her no further than that. His voice was measured, the voice of a man in genuine pain, working not to show how much. Constance looked at him a long moment. Then she set the rifle against the fence post and knelt in the cold dirt beside him and pressed her apron hard against the wound and told him he was not going anywhere before that shoulder had been seen to. It was, she would understand much later, the first of several things Jonas Creed told her that night which were not entirely true. But she did not know that yet as she helped him across the yard, his weight leaning against her with a reluctance that told her he was not accustomed to needing help. To understand what Constance Hale was defending, you have to understand what she and Daniel had built in the 8 years before a stampede took him. They had come to the North Platte River country in 1870 with a land claim and a quality of stubbornness that the Nebraska plain either broke or rewarded depending on what it found beneath it. What it found beneath Daniel and Constance was enough to be rewarded. 400 acres of good bottomland, stocked carefully into one of the more productive cattle operations in Custer County. What made the land more than simply productive was a rail spur laid 3 years after their arrival, running close enough to the southeastern corner of their property that cattle could be moved to it in a single day's drive. In a territory where getting beef to the railroad was half the cost of running cattle at all, that proximity was worth more than the finest pasture land in the county. Daniel died in the spring of 1878. The stampede that took him had begun in the early hours before dawn, moving a herd across a stretch they had crossed 100 times without incident. The inquest ruled it an accident. Constance had never ruled it any such thing. She believed the herd had been spooked by someone, had spent 18 months unable to prove it, and carried the particular exhaustion of a woman who knows what she knows and cannot make anyone else know it with her. Her neighbor to the north, a rancher named Horace Tilden, had wanted the Hale land for years and made his interest in the rail access plain in 2 formal offers to buy after Daniel's death. Both were politely worded, both well below what the land was worth, and both refused. What followed had been 18 months of the kind of pressure a patient man applies when he intends to win by attrition what he cannot win by negotiation. Fences cut along the eastern boundary and blamed on weather. A water source on the northern pasture that had run reliably for 8 years beginning to run low in ways Constance could find no cause for. A bank loan she had taken against the spring cattle run, called due early under terms she could not now find clearly written in the original papers. Each act was deniable on its own, Taken together, they composed a portrait of deliberate ruin that Constance could see perfectly and do nothing about, because a portrait was not evidence, and the sheriff of Custer County dealt in evidence and had made plain he found Tilden's version of events more persuasive than a widow's suspicions. That was the siege Constance was inside, when Jonas Creed arrived bleeding at her gate. She did not know yet that he carried one of his own. Jonas's fever broke on the third night. Constance had sat with him through the worst of it in the small room off the kitchen, cleaning the wound with the practical efficiency of a woman who had spent 8 years on a working ranch and knew the difference between a man sleeping and a man simply losing ground quietly. On the fourth morning, she set a plate of eggs before him, with the directness of a woman who had decided her nursing did not exempt a guest from honest questions, and asked him plainly who had shot him and why. He said a disagreement over a debt, and that it was better for both of them if he said no more than that. Constance looked at him across the table. She had spent 18 months learning to read the shape of a partial truth, the way a man's eyes settle when he is giving you the outline of a thing rather than the thing itself. Jonas Creed's eyes were steady and direct, which told her he was practiced at it. She let it stand, not because she believed him, but because the more useful fact before her was that he healed fast and moved around the ranch within 2 weeks, with a competence that told her he had done this kind of work before. He mended fence with the attention of a man thinking about what a fence line was meant to accomplish rather than simply following the wire. He was quiet in the way of a man listening rather than a man who had nothing to say, and he asked questions that seemed idle and were not. He asked about the water source on the northern pasture. He asked about the Omaha Bank, as if it were ordinary curiosity. He asked about Horace Tilden from a sideways angle, the real question left standing just outside the words themselves. Constance began to notice the shape of what he was doing before she had a name for it. She began, without quite planning to tell him things, not because she had decided to trust him, but because he asked the right questions in the right order, and she had spent 18 months holding the weight of Tilden's campaign with no one alongside her. The relief of being listened to by a man genuinely attending was enough to loosen things she had kept close. She told him about the fences, the water, the loan, what she believed and could not prove about Daniel's death. Jonas listened to all of it with the stillness of a man building something in his own mind, laying each piece of information against the ones before it. He did not offer quick reassurance. He simply listened and asked the next careful question, and listened again. One evening in late summer, mending fence together in the last of the day's light, Constance asked him directly why a man still favoring a healing shoulder seemed so particularly interested in the details of her dispute with her neighbor. Jonas was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said that he had once made his living looking into exactly this kind of trouble, and that old habits were difficult to lose. He said it without elaboration, the way a man says a thing he has decided to risk but not decided to fully explain. It was the first true thing he had told her. She understood it as such, and did not press for the rest, understanding that whatever the rest was, he had offered her this much as a gesture of careful trust, and that pressing would only teach him to offer less next time. She watched him differently after that. She noticed what she had registered without interpreting. The way his eyes moved through a room when they went to town, finding the door and the unfamiliar faces before settling anywhere else. She had taken it for the wariness of a recently shot man. She understood now it was older than the wound. A professional attention worn into him over years, become indistinguishable from his ordinary way of moving through the world. In early autumn, word reached her through the ordinary channels of a small town that a stranger had asked at the general store after a man matching a description not specific but not entirely unlike Jonas. No name, just a vague, patient inquiry. Constance rode home faster than usual and found Jonas at the barn and told him. She watched his face go carefully still, in a way she had not seen since the night at the gate. He asked her to describe the stranger as closely as she could, and relaxed only slightly when her account matched no face he could place. What lived beneath the partial relief was the specific, worn vigilance of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of news for 18 months and had never quite stopped. Horace Tilden's patience sharpened into something more active. Once word reached him that Constance had taken on a hired hand, asking unusually specific questions about water rights and old survey lines. He rode out in early October with 2 of his men flanking him and found Constance and Jonas working near the disputed water source. He did not dismount. He looked Jonas over with the measuring attention of a man identifying a new variable in a calculation he had considered simple, and said to Constance, with the false courtesy he wore as naturally as a good coat, that he was glad she had found help and hoped the arrangement was an entirely proper one, given that a widow alone needed to mind her reputation as carefully as her fences. Constance said the arrangement was entirely her own business. Tilden smiled with his mouth only, and said he had expected nothing less. He rode back toward his own land, leaving behind the specific, deliberate unease of a man who has planted a seed he expects to grow without his tending. The pressure that followed was the most concentrated of the 18 months. The bank in Omaha sent a letter demanding full repayment within 60 days, citing irregularities in the original documentation without specificity. A second water source on the southern edge of the property began running low in a season that had not been particularly dry. And Constance's most reliable hired hand, a man named Otis Webb who had worked the ranch for 3 seasons, gave sudden notice, citing a need to move his family east, and refused when Constance pressed him gently to meet her eyes while explaining. Jonas watched the exchange from across the yard and told Constance afterward that the explanation had the particular shape of a story told by a frightened man. That the pattern troubled him more than the loan or the water, because a man willing to reach directly into a household rather than pressuring it from outside had made a decision about how far he intended to go. He asked to see the original loan papers and everything she had bearing on the water, when it had changed and how much and over what period. Constance brought him everything. Jonas spent 2 evenings at her kitchen table going through it with a methodical, unhurried care that belonged to a man doing work he was genuinely skilled at and had spent a long time pretending he had put behind him. On the 3rd evening he set the papers down and told her what he had found. And then he told her everything else. His real name was not Creed, though Constance would only ever use his real name in private and would later say it made little difference, since the man she had come to know had introduced himself as Jonas Creed and remained so. He had spent 6 years as an investigator for a private agency out of Chicago, the kind of firm that railroads and banks hired to look into organized fraud too large or too well connected for county sheriffs to touch. He had been good at the work, patient and methodical, willing to build a case over months when months were what it required. 18 months earlier, he had been the lead investigator on a federal case against a freight and land fraud syndicate whose reach extended, by the time the trial concluded, into the financial machinery of men considerably more powerful than the low-level operators who actually stood in court. The men who escaped conviction had not forgotten who built the case against them. Jonas's partner on the investigation, a younger man named Will Sutter. They had been found dead in an Omaha alley 4 months after the trial, in circumstances the local police ruled an unfortunate robbery, and that Jonas had never for a moment believed were anything of the kind. He had been running since. A different name in each county, a different trade at each stop, a different reason for moving on before anyone could look closely enough to recognize the pattern. The bullet that brought him to her gate had come from entirely unrelated trouble. He had landed at her fence by accident and stayed because the shoulder required it, and because something about the nature of her problem had engaged a part of him that 18 months of deliberate suppression had not quite managed to extinguish. He told her that he believed he could prove what Tilden had done. The diverted water and the falsified loan and the intimidated hand were all traceable through the kinds of connections and records that a man with his background knew how to follow. But proving it meant using his real skills openly, in a way that left a trail. And a trail of that kind had a chance of being followed by men more organized and more patient than Tilden, with considerably more at stake in the outcome. The choice, he said, was hers. He could continue mending fences under a borrowed name, and she could go on fighting Tilden with the same insufficient tools she had used for 18 months. Or she could ask him to do what he actually knew how to do, understanding that doing it openly carried a risk that was not his alone. Constance looked at him across the kitchen table. The lamp between them threw a quiet light across the papers spread over the surface, the accumulated evidence of a patient man's slow campaign against everything she and Daniel had built. She thought about what he had said when she asked what happened to him if he helped, and it worked. He had answered that then he would have done one honest thing since Will Sutter died, instead of simply running from the fact that he could not save him. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was the first time she had touched him with anything other than practical care, and it was a different kind of touch entirely. She said, "Then we do it together, whatever comes of it." Jonas worked the case the way he had worked every case in the years before the syndicate trial, methodically, without haste, building a record that would hold up to scrutiny rather than collapse under a lawyer's questioning. The loan was the first thread. He traced it back through the Omaha bank's correspondence by indirect letters to contacts he still maintained under his professional name, routed through intermediaries he had spent years establishing, and 18 months hoping never to need. The irregularities cited in the bank's demand had been flagged not by any genuine accounting problem, but by a complaint filed under a name that cross-referenced against county land records proved to be a cousin of Horace. Tilden's, employed at the Omaha Bank in a clerical capacity, giving him access to loan files and a natural cover for the kind of internal inquiry that produced letters demanding early repayment. The water took longer. Jonas spent 3 nights riding the boundary line between the Hale land and Tilden's property in the dark, methodical and patient, until he found it. A channel had been dug recently enough that the disturbed earth around it had not fully settled into its surroundings, diverting a portion of the spring's flow onto Tilden's pastureland before it ever reached the point where Constance's cattle had always drunk. The work was careful, designed to resemble a natural shift in the water table. It did not quite resemble it enough, to a man who knew what to look for and was looking in the dark with a lantern held low to the ground. Otis Webb proved easier to locate. A careful letter routed through a trusted contact, promising confidentiality, reached Webb 2 counties east and drew a response. He admitted that a man representing Tilden's interests had approached him at the feed merchant in September, offered him $50 to leave the Hale ranch, and made clear without using quotable words that continued employment with Constance would be viewed unfavorably by men with long memories and considerable reach. Webb had not wanted to leave. He had a wife and 2 small children and could not afford to learn what unfavorable meant in practice. Jonas documented all of it as he had once documented evidence for federal prosecutors. Dates, records, witnesses where he could find them, each connection laid out plainly enough that it could be followed without his having to explain it, because evidence that required explanation had already begun to lose its force. It was while delivering a formal inquiry to the regional bank examiner in Omaha, using his real name and professional credentials for the first time in 18 months, that Jonas's 2 separate dangers finally fully met. The examiner recognized the name from the syndicate case and remarked, with no malice and no awareness of what he was doing, that he was glad to hear the man was still working, as there had been uncertainty after the events following the trial. A small, innocent remark, but it meant Jonas Creed's real name had appeared in an official record in a professional capacity for the first time in 18 months. He understood, riding back toward the Hale ranch in the autumn dark with the completed case file in his saddlebag, exactly what that meant. He had understood it before he sent the letter. He had sent it anyway, because the alternative was a case that could not be completed, and a case that could not be completed meant Constance losing everything Daniel had built. He had decided, at that kitchen table with her hand over his, that he was no longer willing to let his own safety be the reason that happened. They brought the full case to the county sheriff and to a territorial land commissioner Jonas had once worked alongside, a man whose authority sat above the level where Tilden's influence had been effective. The commissioner reviewed the evidence and found it thorough. The bank connection, the diverted water, the intimidated hand, 18 months of deniable cruelty laid out in sequence with dates and records composing a pattern that was no longer a widow's suspicion. It was a case. Tilden came to the Hale Ranch one final time, alone. He found Constance and Jonas near the water source on the northern pasture, the same one he had spent 2 seasons quietly stealing. He looked at Jonas with the expression of a man who has made a careful calculation and discovered he used wrong numbers. He said that Creed, or whatever his name actually was, had made a great deal of trouble. Jonas said his name was Jonas Creed for every purpose that mattered in that county, and that the land commissioner had all of it now, documented and witnessed, and that there was no arrangement of the coming months that resolved well for Horace Tilden. Tilden looked at Constance for a long moment. The look of a man confronting, too late, the actual cost of 18 months spent underestimating a widow he had assumed would eventually give up. He said nothing further. He turned his horse and rode north. Within the year, facing the commissioner's inquiry and a civil suit Constance filed for the diverted water and the damages from the falsified loan, Tilden sold a significant portion of his own holdings to cover the resulting costs. It was a quieter defeat than any single confrontation could have produced. It was also a more thorough one. The cost Jonas had feared arrived more slowly and in a form less severe than he had prepared for. His name appeared in territorial records twice more in connection with the case. Whether the men who had once hunted him had lost track of him or simply moved on to other concerns, they did not come. Jonas remained watchful for 2 years. Constance never tried to talk him out of it, understanding that a man who has lost a partner to that kind of danger has earned his caution regardless of how the danger eventually resolves. Slowly, the watchfulness eased into the ordinary alertness of a rancher attending to weather and fences. He stopped running. He stayed. They married in the spring, in a short ceremony at the ranch house where he had first opened his eyes to find her pressing an apron against his wound with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had no patience for dramatics. The ceremony was attended by the neighbors who had continued to speak to Constance through the long months, and by the commissioner, who shook Jonas's hand with the warm formality of a man who had known the groom in another life and approved of this one. Constance kept Daniel's name on the deed alongside her own. Jonas never asked her to remove it. He understood without being told that the land had been built by 2 people over 8 years, and that one of them deserved to remain named on it regardless of who she married afterward. He understood this because he was the kind of man who knew what it meant to carry someone you had lost, and to carry them not as a burden but as a measure of what they had been worth. There is one detail about the gate that tells you most of what you need to know about the kind of people they were. The following summer they rebuilt it together, the old post having softened to the point of unreliability. They hung the new gate on cedar posts that Jonas set deep and straight, the way he had learned on Constance's first fence line, the one that had taught him what the ground required and what it meant to build something for himself rather than for a wage. When the gate was finished, Jonas took his pocket knife and cut a small mark into the new post, a private notation that meant nothing to anyone who saw it, and everything to the 2 people who knew what had happened at that gate in the dark, the night a bleeding man made no move toward his gun, and a widow decided what that told her. Now, before we reach the end, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. If you had been standing where Constance stood that night, would you have helped the stranger, or would you have turned him away? Tell me what you would have done. And tell me what part of the world you are listening from while you decide. Now let us get back to where we were. Constance and Jonas ranched the Hale land together for 34 years. The water sources ran clean and undisturbed for all of them. The rail spur that had once made the land worth taking eventually became the foundation of a cattle operation. Their children took over with the quiet confidence of people who have grown up watching two steady adults build something worth inheriting. Constance liked to tell her grandchildren that the very thing Tilden had tried to steal from her rewarded patience and honest work most generously in the end. Not justice exactly, she would say, but close enough to be satisfying. Otis Webb wrote to Constance 6 years later, after Tilden's fall had become common knowledge. He apologized for leaving and asked, with a sheepishness that came through even in his careful handwriting, whether there might be any work still available at the Hale place. Constance hired him back without hesitation, telling Jonas that a man honest enough to admit his own fear in writing, and then admit it a second time by asking for the chance to do better, deserved exactly that chance. That Tilden himself had never once extended to anyone. There is something particular about the kind of courage that does not express itself as a single dramatic act, but as a series of quiet decisions, each one small enough to appear manageable on its own, and large enough taken together to change the course of a life entirely. Constance Hale did not make one brave decision the night she found Jonas bleeding at her gate. She made a dozen small ones. To press her apron against the wound, to help him across the yard, to ask the honest question over breakfast, to begin telling him the truth about Tilden, to put her hand over his across the kitchen table and say 4 plain words. Each decision was modest. The accumulation of them was not. Jonas Creed did not make one brave decision the evening he told Constance his real name and what it might cost her to know it. He made the decision to stop letting the loss of Will Sutter be a reason for smallness, to use what he knew in the service of something that deserved it, to be, once more and openly, the man he actually was, rather than the succession of borrowed names he had been moving through. The bravery was in the honesty, not the drama. It nearly always is, out here, where the land does not reward performance and has no patience for anything that is not solid underneath. Some love arrives in a single, decisive moment. A declaration made in firelight, a meeting of eyes across a crowded room that rearranges everything instantly. That kind of love has its own truth. But there is another kind. The kind that builds itself in the spaces between careful questions and honest answers. In the accumulated weight of 100 small acts of trust offered and received. In the particular intimacy of 2 people who recognize in each other the exact skill their own fight has been missing. That kind of love does not arrive. It accumulates. It gathers the way good Nebraska soil gathers along the low banks of a river, patient and quiet and permanently there once it is settled, and no patient, well-connected man in the world can divert it once it has found its course. Thank you for riding with me today. I am grateful you were here. Until next time, keep riding and keep writing.